Hello, I'm Joseph Rescigno, talking about my book, Conducting Opera Where Theater Meets Music. What you just heard was a melody from the third act of Puccini's Tosca. It happens 4 times in the act, and each time it has different note values, different dynamics, and different tempo indications. And yet, it's usually heard, phrased the same as this example that the clarinet plays before the aria. And why? Tradition. Now, this is discussed at length in my book, but in the space of this video, we don't have the time to go into it. But it opens the door to the topic, tradition. Now, sometimes traditions are actually printed into the music. An example is in Rodolfo's Act 1 aria from Puccini's La Bohème. The piano vocal has a note that he sings that is missing in the orchestral score. It happens here. That last note I played, that D, is just a rest in the orchestra score. Now, you almost always hear it sung by the tenor. What you hear is this. But if you observe the rest instead, you don't have to stretch or change the rhythm to compensate for a breath, and you get a much smoother phrase. In addition, as you hear, that D is just a passing tone, a note that is not in the key that we're playing, that connects 2 chords, that connects this chord and this chord. So just leaving it in the violins is actually a very good solution. Now, another example of something that is printed in the piano vocal score that is missing in the orchestral score is in the last act of Puccini's Tosca. There is a phrase that the soprano sings. Now, I will play it and sing it the way you usually hear it. Io quella lama li piantai nel cor. Under that line of hers, io quella lama li piantai nel cor, in the piano vocal, you have the phrase col canto, with the vocal line, with the song. And then in the second measure, rallentando. That phrase, col canto, does not exist in the orchestral score. Number 1. So you just have the rallentando after she sings the high C. In addition, there is a series of arpeggi built up, the structure of that phrase. And if we ignore this col canto and go with the orchestra score, she comes in a tempo matching the arpeggi that the orchestra has played. Io quella lama li piantai nel cor. Because in addition, instead of that low note, it's the note an octave higher. What does that do? Well, it makes it a lot more exciting. Secondly, unless it's a very, very heavy, dramatic voice, a Wagnerian voice, she has to chest that is, use her like a Broadway chest voice to sing this low C. And frankly, at least for my taste, that's a bit vulgar. So, does that mean that all tradition is bad? Well, some people say that tradition is just the memory of the last bad performance. I would not go that far. However, what tradition is practices that happened after the composer laid down his pen. So, in many cases, I would go with the composer's ideas and not with what has become the tradition. But it's important to know what the traditions are and why they happened, and your good taste and your analysis to decide whether to use them, modify them, or reject them. Now, some are excellent. You have the E flat at the end of Sempre Libera in Traviata. If the singer has the note, it's solid and it's good. This is really exciting, and people have loved it for the last 150 years. Some other traditions, however, that have crept in may be musically okay, but do a disservice because of the words involved. A case in point is the first aria for the baritone in Act 1 of Donizetti's Lucia. The first time you hear the tune, it's on the repeat. Traditionally, most baritones sing just as notes go. This is fine. But the text says "Pria che d'amor si perfido," and it puts the high note and the accent on the O of perfido, like perfido. However, that's not how the word is pronounced. The last few times I did the opera, I suggested the following to the baritone if he wanted to sing this G. Pria che d'amor si perfido. Putting the G on the appropriate vowel, so you don't have the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Now, I must say that I have heard this strange usage even by native Italians, because it's tradition. Another example, not too serious, but still interesting, in the cabaletta that follows this, there is, both in the piano vocal score and in the orchestral score, a rallentando for 2.5 measures and then a return to a tempo. It always seemed a little forced to me because it's a fairly simple tune, and the rallentando never made a great deal of sense to me. But this is what we hear. Here it's slower. And back to tempo. Well, I do have access to the facsimile of the autograph score. And I went to it, I checked it, when I finally was able to get access to it. And lo and behold, there is no retard written. So you hear this like this. Which I think, given the anger of the situation and the circumstances, is far more appropriate. Now, another example of a strange tradition, in this case, that goes against the words of the text and the indications of the composer, is in the aria of Juliet from the opera Romeo et Juliet of Gounod, in her aria Je veux vivre. There comes a point just a little bit before the end where he writes un peu moins vite, mais très peu. A little less fast, but just a little. And the text says, loin de l'hiver morose, laisse-moi sommeiller. Far from gloomy winter, let me dream. All right, if this is the tempo, a little slower for that phrase would be loin de l'hiver morose, laisse-moi sommeiller et respirer la rose. She says far from, but how often, even with French sopranos, do you hear loin de l'hiver morose, laisse-moi sommeiller. It's that l'hiver morose, but she says loin, and more importantly, the composer writes just a little bit, please, très peu, a little bit slower. Finally, I'd like to talk about the Barber of Seville. No opera in the repertoire has so much baggage than the Barber of Seville. But I'd like to, in this case, you could talk almost about the tradition in every single number. I'd like to, though, talk about the aria of Bartolo, A un dottor della mia sorte. Now, most performers begin at a certain tempo, then cut that tempo in half, where there's no indication to do so, and do this 3 times in the first half of the aria, and then modify the melody that returns at the end of the opera, at the end of the vivace section, at a slower tempo to match what they did in the first half. Now, why did this happen? There could be many reasons. For one, the aria is very difficult. In fact, in Rossini's time, a composer called Pietro Romani wrote a substitute aria, Manca un foglio, that for years was performed in this place. When it began to be much more popular to do the aria that Rossini wrote in the 40s and 50s, it was drastically cut. A cut was made in the first half of the aria, and the second half, the vivace, over 50% of that was cut. And so, with that as an excuse, they began to monkey around with the tempo. It hurt the aria on several levels. Number one, the indication that Rossini put over the aria in the beginning. It's andante maestoso. Okay, what does that mean? It means andare, to go, walking, going majestically. And Bartolo thinks of himself as majestic. It's very ironic because he is the butt of the joke of the opera. Secondly, you lose that pomposity in the beginning, and then you have to manipulate all around to make the cut-down aria work. Now, let me just play a little bit of how you usually hear it. Conductor della mia sorte, queste scuse, signorina. Conductor della mia sorte, queste scuse, signorina. And now half tempo. Vi consiglio, mia carina, un po' meglio imposturar. Meglio, 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 meglio. And the tune is Vi consiglio, mia carina, un po' meglio imposturar. All right. what happens if we take this andante maestoso, slow 4 in the beginning, and just keep that tempo? Conductor della mia sorte, queste scuse signorina, Conductor della mia sorte, queste scuse signorina. Tempo. Vi consiglio, mia carina, un po' meglio imposturar, meglio. Vi consiglio, mia carina, un po' meglio imposturar, meglio. Vi consiglio, mia carina, un po' meglio imposturar. Now, when we have the second half, which is very fast, double the tempo, and that at the end of that section, the same tune that we just heard returns, you don't have to touch it. You don't have to manipulate it. You can just play it at that tempo. Conductor della mia sorte, non si lasci infinocchiare. So we see it gives the pomposity to the character in the beginning, and we can just do what he put down on paper, and it works beautifully. So if you find this topic of tradition interesting, I really urge you to get my book. Every single chapter talks about it. Even in Wagner, there are traditions, some good, some not so good. The only exception is the chapter on Richard Strauss. As of yet, there are not any distortions or traditions built up in Strauss. But give it another 100 years, I'm sure there will be some steamer trunks arriving. Thank you. I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Push the little button that says subscribe underneath, and to share it with your friends you think would find it interesting.